The sun was not yet a rumor in Crestfall, Wyoming, but a faint, pearlescent wash had begun to dilute the ink of the eastern sky. It was the hour of predators and profound quiet, a time Callum Harte knew from a lifetime of rising before the dawn. He stood on his porch, a mug of coffee warming his hands, and watched the world hold its breath. His world was one of fence lines and the health of cattle, of the smell of hay in the barn and the solid heft of an axe. It was a simple, orderly existence, and he was a man who valued order above most things. Then he saw her, a figure on the road, walking with a determined, almost frantic pace that was at odds with the sleeping landscape. Even from a distance, he recognized the set of her shoulders. Ottie Fenmore. Her 40 acres bordered his own to the south, a small, tidy plot she had inherited and worked with a quiet tenacity that Callum had noted and respected. He had seen her in town, at the general store, her interactions always brief, polite, and contained. She was 31, a woman alone, and the town of Crestfall watched over her with a collective, unspoken sense of guardianship. She did not walk to his gate. She walked right up the path to his porch steps, her boots making soft, urgent sounds in the dust. She stopped at the bottom step, her hands clenched at her sides. In the growing light, he could see the strain around her eyes, the pallor of her skin beneath a dusting of freckles. Her hair was pinned up as neatly as ever, but a few strands had escaped, clinging to her temples. She wore a practical brown dress, the kind a woman wore for a day of hard work, not for a pre-dawn social call. Callum remained where he was, leaning against the porch post. He did not speak. He waited. He had learned long ago that the best way to understand a situation was to let it unfold at its own pace. Ottie Fenmore took a deep, shuddering breath, as if steeling herself for a leap from a great height. "Mr. Harte," she began, her voice low and tight. "I apologize for the hour. I would not be here if it were not a matter of extreme urgency." He gave a slight, permissive nod. The steam from his coffee curled between them in the cool air. "My uncle, as you may know, has petitioned the court for guardianship over my affairs." She said the words as if they were stones in her mouth. "The hearing was set for Saturday. He has had it moved to Thursday, 2 days from now." A pause. The silence stretched, filled only by the chirping of a single early bird. "I have been advised," she continued, her gaze fixed on a spot just past his shoulder, "that there is a provision in the law. A simple one. A married woman cannot be made the ward of a male relative. Her husband is her legal guardian." She finally lifted her eyes to his, and he saw the raw desperation she had tried so hard to conceal. "The petition becomes moot. Mr. Harte, I need a name on a marriage license before the courthouse closes today. I need your name to escape my uncle." She had a whole speech prepared, he could tell. It was there in the tense line of her jaw, in the way she held her breath, ready to launch into justifications and pleas and promises of annulment. He could see the shape of the words she had not yet said, the careful arguments she had rehearsed on her frantic walk through the dark. He saw the fierce pride warring with her stark terror. He pushed himself off the post and set his coffee mug down on the railing. "Yes," Callum said. The sound of the single word was so plain, so immediate, that it seemed to stun her into silence. Her mouth, which had been slightly open to continue her speech, closed. Her eyes widened. "But I haven't." "You have," he said, his voice even. "You have it. My name." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just a desperate neighbor, but the capable woman who had single-handedly re-roofed her own shed last fall, and who haggled with Mr. Henderson at the mercantile with a calm, unshakable logic. "Come inside, Mistress Fenmore. The coffee is fresh. We have a plan to make." For a long moment, she did not move. Then, a tremor went through her, a visible release of tension so profound it was as if she might collapse. She gave a single sharp nod and mounted the steps. He held the door for her. She stepped past him into the dim warmth of his house, and for the first time since her father had passed 2 years ago, Ottie Fenmore felt the ground beneath her feet feel solid again. Callum's kitchen was a reflection of the man himself, clean, functional, and devoid of clutter. A cast-iron stove stood against one wall, its surface gleaming. A long wooden table, scrubbed to a pale smoothness, dominated the center of the room. The air smelled of coffee, wood smoke, and the faint, pleasant scent of saddle soap. He gestured for her to sit at the table while he retrieved another mug from a shelf. He moved with an economy of motion, nothing wasted. He poured her a coffee, black, and set it before her. She wrapped her cold hands around the warm ceramic, the simple heat a comfort. He took the seat opposite her, his own hands resting on the table. They were large, calloused, the hands of a man who worked with the earth and with animals. Steady hands. "The clerk's office opens at 8, he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "We will be there when it does. Judge Milner is a fair man. He will hear us out. The preacher, Mr. Albright, lives 2 doors down from the courthouse. His wife can serve as a witness. He had laid it all out, a clear path through the legal briar patch that had threatened to consume her. She had come expecting to beg, to bargain, to humiliate herself. Instead, she had been met with a quiet, unshakable plan. Why? The word escaped her, barely a whisper. "You don't know me, Mr. Harte." "Not really." Callum looked into his coffee mug for a long moment before answering. A memory surfaced, clear and sharp. Her uncle, Thaddeus Fenmore, standing right where she was now sitting almost a year ago. He had been all smiles and false bonhomie, a scent of cheap whiskey on his breath even in the middle of the afternoon. He had come with a proposition. "That stand of old-growth timber on my niece's northern edge," Thaddeus had said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "She has no use for it. A woman alone. I can get you the rights, Harte. A good price. She trusts her old uncle to handle her business." Callum had known, instantly, that the timber rights were not Thaddeus's to sell. He had seen the plat maps. The trees were squarely on Ottie's 40 acres, the same acres her father had cherished. He had shown Thaddeus the door, the dismissal cold and final. He had considered telling Ottie about it, warning her. But how did a man approach a neighbor he barely knew and tell her that her only living relative was a thief? It felt like an overstep, an intrusion. So he had said nothing. He had simply watched and waited and kept a closer eye on the fence line they shared. He would not tell her this now. It was not the time. It would sound like he was keeping score, and that was not it at all. "I know your uncle," Callum said at last, raising his eyes to meet hers. The simple statement hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. That's reason enough. She understood. Or at least, she understood a part of it. She nodded slowly, taking a sip of the hot, bitter coffee. It burned a welcome trail down to her stomach. The ride into Crestfall was quiet. Callum handled the team with a gentle, confident hand, the wagon wheels crunching rhythmically on the dirt road. Ottie sat on the bench beside him, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She watched the familiar landscape of rolling hills and distant, sharp-peaked mountains slide by. For the first time in months, she was not looking at it and calculating its potential loss. She was simply seeing it. The sight filled her with a strange, hollow ache that was part grief, part hope. At the clerk's office, a small, balding man named Mr. Abernathy looked up from his ledger. His eyes flickered from Callum's stoic face to Ottie's pale one, and a flicker of understanding passed through them. In a town like Crestfall, there were few secrets, only stories that had not yet been widely told. He asked the requisite questions in a monotone, filled out the license with a scratchy pen, and accepted Callum's coin without comment. He slid the document across the counter. It felt impossibly flimsy to hold such weight. The preacher's house smelled of beeswax and boiled cabbage. Mr. Albright was a thin, earnest man with kind eyes. His wife, a stout woman with flour on her apron, stood beside Ottie, her presence a silent, maternal comfort. The ceremony was conducted in the small, sun-dusted parlor. The words were ancient and simple, stripped of all fanfare. "Do you, Callum Harte, take this woman, Ottie Fenmore, to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." Callum's voice was firm, unwavering. "Do you, Ottie Fenmore, take this man, Callum Harte, to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Her voice was smaller, but just as clear. "I do." And it was done. A few strokes of a pen, a handful of words. They walked out into the stark Wyoming sunlight as husband and wife. The world looked exactly the same, yet everything had changed. The ride back to the ranch was even quieter than the ride in. A new kind of silence had settled between them, one tinged with awkwardness and the profound, unspoken reality of their new arrangement. When they arrived back at the house, Callum unhitched the team while Ottie stood uncertainly on the porch. Her house, her small, safe world, was just visible across the fields. This house was now her home. It was a staggering thought. Callum came up the steps, wiping his hands on a rag. "The bedroom is yours," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "The main one. I'll take the small room off the kitchen. It's where I sleep most nights during calving season anyway." It was a gesture of profound respect, a clear demarcation of the nature of their agreement. This was a partnership in name only. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. That night, she lay in the large, unfamiliar bed. It smelled faintly of him, of clean cotton, sunshine, and soap. She listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling around her, the creak of floorboards, the sigh of the wind in the eaves. For the first time in 2 years, she was not alone in a house at night. The relief was so immense, so bone-deep, that it felt like a physical weight pressing her into the mattress. She did not weep. She simply lay there, breathing in the quiet safety of it all, until sleep finally took her. 2 days later, they stood before Judge Milner in his chambers. Her uncle Thaddeus was already there, his face a mask of false concern. He looked from Ottie to Callum, a sneer touching his lips. "Your Honor," Thaddeus began, his voice oozing sympathy. "My poor niece, she is unwell, easily influenced. This man has clearly taken advantage of her fragile state." "Is that so, Mr. Harte?" the judge asked, his eyes sharp and intelligent. Callum did not rise to the bait. He simply stepped forward and placed the marriage license on the judge's polished desk. "My wife and I were married on Tuesday, Your Honor." Judge Milner picked up the document. He read it carefully, his expression unreadable. He looked at the date. He looked at Ottie, who stood tall and silent beside her new husband. He looked at Thaddeus, whose face had begun to mottle with rage. The judge set the license down. "A married woman is under the legal protection of her husband," he stated, his voice flat and official. "This court has no jurisdiction here. The petition for guardianship is moot." He banged his gavel once, a sharp, final sound. "This matter is dismissed." Thaddeus stared, his mouth agape. He turned a venomous glare on Ottie, a look so full of malice that she instinctively took a small step closer to Callum. It was not a look of concern. It was the look of a man whose prize had been snatched from his grasp. He stormed out of the chambers without another word. They walked out into the hallway, the victory strangely anticlimactic. Nothing had been truly won. Only a single battle in a war she now realized had been going on for years. "Thank you," she said softly, looking up at Callum. "I'm your husband, Ottie," he replied, as if it were the simplest, most obvious fact in the world. "It's my place to be." He said her first name for the first time, and the sound of it in his low voice settled something deep inside her. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm. A strange, quiet domesticity bloomed in the space between them. Ottie, accustomed to running her own home, seamlessly took over the running of Callum's. The house became warmer, filled with the smells of baking bread and simmering stews. She mended his work shirts, her stitches small and neat. She started a vegetable garden behind the house, the neat rows a testament to her need for order. Callum, in turn, continued his life on the ranch, but with a new awareness. He found himself listening for the sound of her moving about the house when he came in from the fields. He took to fixing things he had long ignored, a loose board on the porch, a sticking drawer in the kitchen, the squeaking hinge on the gate to her new garden. They were small, unspoken gestures, a language of care built from wood and nail and thread. They spoke of practical things, the weather, the price of feed in town, a coyote that had been spotted near the creek. They never spoke of her uncle. They never spoke of the nature of their marriage. It was a fragile peace, a carefully constructed reality they both tacitly agreed not to disturb. The awkwardness of the first few days softened into a comfortable quiet. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, he cleaning a piece of harness, she with her mending, and watch the sun set behind the mountains. The silence was no longer empty. It was shared. One afternoon, 3 weeks after the hearing, the mail rider brought a letter. It was addressed to her in her maiden name, Ottie Fenmore. It bore the seal of the county land office. A cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. She took it to the kitchen table, her hands suddenly unsteady. Callum had just come in for a drink of water and saw the color drain from her face. He stood by the door, watching, his presence a silent offer of support. She slit the envelope open with a kitchen knife. Inside was a sheaf of official-looking documents. She read the first page, then the second. It was a formal notice of an easement claim against her 40 acres. A right-of-way, filed by a timber concern she had never heard of, that would allow them to build a hauling road straight through the center of her property, effectively cutting it in two and rendering it useless for grazing or farming. But it was the supporting documents that made her blood run cold. Attached were copies of filings, surveys, and affidavits, some dating back more than a year. All of them bore what looked like her signature. Forgeries, clumsy ones if you knew what to look for, but perhaps convincing enough to a busy clerk. And the man who had filed the original petitions on behalf of the timber company, the man who had witnessed the forged signatures, was Thaddeus Fenmore. This was not a sudden act of spite. This was a long, carefully laid trap. The guardianship had been Plan A. This was Plan B. He had been working to steal her land, piece by legal piece, for years. She did not cry. She did not panic. A cold, clear anger rose in her, sharpening her thoughts. She spread the papers across the table, her mind racing. She had helped her father with his own paperwork for years. She knew the language of deeds and claims. She saw the inconsistencies, the impossible timelines, the legal shortcuts he had taken. Section, she pointed to one of the filings. This survey, she said, her voice tight with fury. It was supposedly filed last October. But the surveyor named here, Mr. Clark. He died in August. I sent flowers to his widow. Section, she picked up another. And this affidavit. He claims I signed it in his presence in Cheyenne on March the 4th. I was in Crestfall on March the 4th. I bought seed potatoes from Mr. Henderson. He'll have it in his ledger. One by one, she began to dismantle the fraudulent claim, not with emotion, but with cold, hard facts. She made a list, her handwriting neat and precise despite the tremor of rage in her hand. Callum watched her, his initial instinct to protect her giving way to a profound sense of awe. He had married her to save her from her uncle. He was now realizing she was more than capable of saving herself. She just needed someone to stand with her while she did it. When she was finished, she looked up at him, her eyes bright with battle. He will not have it, she said. It was a vow. No, Callum agreed, his voice a low growl. He will not. He moved to the table, his presence solid and reassuring. We ride to town in the morning. We'll see Judge Milner. Together. The ride to town the next day was entirely different from their first journey. There was no uncertainty, no awkwardness. They were a unit, bound by a common purpose. Ottie held the portfolio of papers in her lap, her notes tucked neatly inside. Callum drove the team, his jaw set in a hard line. They were not a man and a woman in a strange arrangement. They were a husband and wife going to war. They did not have to wait. When Judge Milner's clerk saw them, he showed them directly into the judge's chambers. The judge was sitting behind his desk, reading a thick legal volume. He looked up, his expression serious. Mistress Harte, Mr. Harte, I had a feeling I would be seeing you again. My uncle has made another move, Your Honor, Ottie said, her voice steady. She stepped forward and laid the papers on his desk, just as Callum had laid the marriage license weeks before. For the next hour, Ottie laid out the case. She spoke clearly and logically, her voice never wavering. She walked the judge through the fraudulent survey, the forged signatures, the perjured affidavits. She presented her own evidence, the date of the surveyor's death, the receipt from the mercantile, the testimony of neighbors who could place her in Crestfall when she was supposedly in another city. She unraveled her uncle's web of deceit thread by thread, exposing the long, calculated pattern of his greed. Callum stood beside her, silent. He was her anchor, his quiet presence a testament to his belief in her. He did not need to speak. His being there spoke volumes. Judge Milner listened intently, his fingers steepled before him. His eyes grew colder and harder as Ottie spoke. He examined the forgeries, his lips thinning into a grim line. When she was finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Thaddeus Fenmore has attempted to perpetrate a fraud upon this court and upon his own family, the judge said, his voice like chipping stone. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that this was not the first time Mr. Fenmore's name had come up in questionable land dealings. He spoke of a failed attempt to sell timber rights off another property the year prior. A dawning realization began to prickle at the back of Ottie's mind. I will issue an immediate injunction against this easement, the judge continued, and I will be forwarding this file to the district attorney. Perjury and forgery are serious crimes, Mistress Harte. I do not think your uncle will be troubling you again. The ride home was quiet, but it was a new silence, one filled with the coming dusk and the vast, open space of their shared future. The legal battles were over. The tension that had been a constant companion for years had finally dissipated, leaving a clean, quiet emptiness in its wake. They were halfway back to the ranch, the sky turning a deep bruised purple, when Ottie finally spoke the thought that had been solidifying in her mind. The timber rights, she said, not looking at him. The ones the judge mentioned. The ones my uncle tried to sell last year. She turned her head to face him, her expression searching. That was my land, wasn't it? The timber on my northern edge. Callum kept his eyes on the road, but she saw a muscle tighten in his jaw. He gave a single, slow nod. He came to see you, she stated. It was not a question. He tried to sell you my trees. Yes, Callum said. And you sent him away. Yes. She stared at his profile, silhouetted against the fading light. The quiet, solid man who had said yes before she had even finished asking her desperate question. The man who had offered her coffee and a plan. The man who had given her his name and his protection without a moment's hesitation. It had not been a spur-of-the-moment act of charity for a neighbor in distress. It had not been mere pity. You knew, she whispered, the full weight of it finally landing on her. You knew what he was. All this time. A year ago, you knew. He finally turned to look at her, his gaze steady and direct in the dim light. I knew, he confirmed. I didn't think it was my place to speak of it then. It is now. And in that moment, Ottie understood everything. He had not just been her savior on that one desperate morning. He had been her silent ally for more than a year, watching from a distance, standing guard over a line on a map because he knew the character of the man who threatened it. His immediate yes had not been an impulse. It had been the culmination of a year of quiet observation and settled conviction. He had chosen his side long before she ever came to his porch. The practical arrangement, the marriage of convenience, fell away. What was left was something far more real and substantial. It was a partnership forged not in romance, but in shared principle and quiet allegiance. He had not married her out of pity. He had married her because he believed in her right to her own land, her own life. He had married her because he respected the woman who worked that land. She did not say, "Thank you," again. The words were too small for the truth that now sat between them. She simply held his gaze, and in the shared look, everything that needed to be said was said. The foundation of their life together was not a desperate bargain. It was this solid, unspoken understanding, this quiet, unwavering support. She turned her eyes back to the road ahead, to the dark shape of the ranch house waiting for them in the distance. Her home. Their home. She felt his hand, large and warm, cover hers where it rested on the wagon seat. She did not pull away. She simply turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. 5 years later, the evening light slanted low across the porch, painting the world in shades of gold and amber. Callum sat in his usual chair, mending a piece of bridle leather, the motions of his hands practiced and sure. The scent of the leather oil was rich and familiar. Ottie sat opposite him, a bowl of peas in her lap, her fingers moving rhythmically as she shelled them, the small green spheres making a soft pattering sound as they fell into a tin bowl. A comfortable silence stretched between them, the kind that is not empty but full of shared history. In the yard, 2 small children played in the dust. A boy of 4, Daniel, with his father's steady gaze and quiet disposition, was carefully lining up stones along the edge of the garden. A girl of 2, Clara, with her mother's determined chin and a shock of unruly dark hair, was trying to convince a chicken to be her friend. "The fence along the south pasture needs seeing to," Callum said, not looking up from his work. "Post is rotting at the base." "I noticed that yesterday," Ottie replied. "The ground is soft there from the spring runoff. Always is." "I'll fix it tomorrow," he said. "I'll pack you a lunch," she answered. It was a simple exchange, the kind they had a dozen times a day. It was the language of their life, a litany of practicalities that formed the bedrock of their marriage. He had never been a man of grand pronouncements or flowery words. His love was in the solid fence post, the mended roof, the steady presence of him in the house. Her love was in the hot meal waiting for him, the neat patch on his shirt, the order she brought to their shared world. He finished his work, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at his wife, at the way the fading light caught the silver threads that had begun to appear at her temples. He looked at his children, their small forms intent on their play. He looked at the house, solid and warm behind them. His life had an order now that he had never known was possible. A completeness. Ottie felt his gaze on her and looked up, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. "You were slow to realize it, Callum Harte," she said softly. He raised an eyebrow. "Slow about what?" "Both, I expect," she said, her smile widening. "Me? This." She gestured to the porch, the yard, the life they had built. He considered this for a moment. Then, a slow, rare smile spread across his own face. It transformed his stern features, making him look younger. "I got there," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "You did." He reached across the space between them and took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. Her fingers, stained green from the peas, curled around his. They sat there for a long time, hands clasped, watching their children play as the last of the light bled from the sky and the first stars began to appear, sharp and brilliant in the vast Wyoming dark. That is how a life is truly built, isn't it? Not always with a thunderclap of passion, but often with the quiet certainty of a helping hand. It is not always found in shouted declarations, but in the unspoken promise to stand with someone against the storm. Love, in its most enduring form, is often a practical thing. It is a choice, made in a quiet moment, to be on someone's side. It is the steady daily work of mending fences and sharing silence, of building a shelter together, and then, day by day, turning that shelter into a home.